"You don't belong anywhere near this submarine, sir." The lieutenant's voice cut clean through the salt-heavy air, sharp as steel against steel, stopping just short of the gangway that led into the heart of the vessel. The nuclear submarine loomed behind him, a dark, curved mass stretching over 400 feet along the dock, its hull drinking in the late afternoon sun, its surface broken only by rivet lines and the faint shimmer of heat rising from metal that had baked all day. Crew members moved with purpose across the deck, boots striking hollow notes against the plating, radios murmuring low, cables swaying gently in the ocean breeze, but the moment the old man stepped forward, everything seemed to slow, just enough to notice. He didn't look like someone who should be here. His jacket was worn thin at the elbows, a faded olive drab that had long since lost its original color, his jeans creased from years of use, not style, and his boots carried the dull scuff of miles, not shine. No insignia. No clearance badge. No visible rank. Just a man standing still, eyes fixed on the submarine as if it were something more than a machine. Lieutenant Kyle Mercer adjusted his posture, shoulders squared, jaw set with the kind of authority that had been recently earned and carefully guarded. He stepped forward, placing himself directly between the old man and the narrow steel steps. "This is a restricted naval asset," he said, slower this time, as if speaking to someone who simply didn't understand. "Authorized personnel only." A few sailors nearby exchanged glances, their expressions caught somewhere between curiosity and quiet amusement. One of them let out a faint chuckle, quickly masked behind the back of his hand. To them, it was obvious. Another confused civilian who had wandered too close to something he didn't comprehend. The old man didn't respond right away. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of saltwater and diesel fuel across the dock, tugging lightly at the edges of his jacket. His gaze never left the submarine. It moved slowly, deliberately, tracing the curve of the hull, the lines of the hatch, the details most people never noticed. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, and carried a weight that didn't match his appearance. "I'm not here by accident." Mercer let out a short breath through his nose, something between a laugh and a dismissal. "Yeah, that's usually what they all say." He gestured loosely toward the security line behind him. "Tours ended an hour ago. If you're looking for that, you're in the wrong place." Another ripple of quiet laughter passed through the nearby crew. The old man's expression didn't change. If he heard them, he didn't show it. He took a small step forward, not aggressive, not defiant, just certain, and that was enough for Mercer to raise a hand, palm out, stopping him cold. The contact never came, but the line was clear. "Sir," Mercer said, firmer now, "you need to step back." The old man's eyes finally shifted, lifting from the steel giant behind the lieutenant to meet his gaze. They were pale, clear, and steady in a way that made Mercer hesitate for just a fraction of a second, though he couldn't explain why. There was no anger in them. No confusion. Just something deeper. Something that didn't ask for permission. "I helped bring her to life," the old man said quietly. For a beat, the words hung there, almost lost in the wind and the distant hum of machinery. Then Mercer shook his head, a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth as he looked back at the others. "Right," he said, the sarcasm easy now. "And I built the fleet." A couple of sailors laughed more openly this time. One leaned against a railing, watching the exchange like it was entertainment breaking up the routine of the day. Mercer stepped closer, closing the distance, his tone dropping just enough to make it clear this was no longer a conversation. "Last warning," he said. "Step away from the vessel." The old man didn't move. Not back. Not forward. Just still. Behind them, the submarine sat silent, immense, its presence pressing into the air like something alive, something listening, and for reasons Mercer couldn't quite place, the quiet around them began to feel heavier than it should have. The lieutenant held his ground, but the moment stretched longer than it should have, as if something unseen had settled over the dock and refused to move, and behind him the submarine remained silent, its massive form absorbing every word without response, while the old man simply stood there, unshaken, his posture relaxed but rooted in a way that made stepping around him feel impossible, even though nothing physically blocked the path, and Mercer felt it, that faint pressure he could not explain, like walking into a room where everyone had already decided something important without telling you, so he straightened again, pushing the feeling aside, tightening his grip on the situation the only way he knew how, through authority, through procedure, through rules that had always made things clear. "You heard me," he said, sharper now, louder so the others could hear and reinforce the moment. "This area is restricted, and you are not authorized to be here." And the words landed with practiced precision, the kind drilled into him through years of training, but the old man did not flinch, did not argue, did not even seem offended, which somehow made it worse, because there was nothing to push against, nothing to dominate, just that same quiet presence, steady as the tide against the hull, and it began to draw attention. More of it now, sailors slowing their steps. Conversations dropping into murmurs, a chief petty officer pausing halfway up the ladder to the deck, watching with narrowed eyes, not intervening, just observing, and that was when Mercer noticed the detail he had missed before, small enough to overlook, dull enough to seem meaningless, a thin piece of metal hanging from a frayed cord tucked just beneath the collar of the old man's jacket, barely visible unless you were close enough to care. And Mercer reached for it without thinking, driven more by irritation than curiosity, pinching it lightly between two fingers and pulling it into the light. "What is this supposed to be?" he said, turning it slightly, the metal catching the sun for just a second, revealing scratches, worn edges, something that had not been polished in decades, some kind of souvenir, and a few of the nearby sailors leaned in, interest sharpening now that there was something tangible to mock, something to reduce the man to a story they understood, a relic, a leftover piece of history that no longer applied. But the old man's hand moved, not fast, not aggressive, just certain, closing gently over Mercer's wrist, stopping the motion, and for the first time there was a shift, subtle but unmistakable, the air tightening around that single point of contact, and when he spoke, his voice had changed, still calm, still low, but carrying something deeper, something that did not need volume to command attention. "You should not touch that," he said, and the words were simple, but they carried weight, the kind that came from memory rather than warning, and Mercer felt it before he could dismiss it, a flicker of hesitation, quickly buried under pride, because there were eyes on him now, expectations, a line he could not step back from without losing something he had worked too hard to earn, so he pulled his hand free with a short, dismissive motion, holding the metal piece up again for everyone to see. "Relax," he said, forcing a smirk, "it is just a piece of scrap." But even as he said it, something about the object did not fit that description, the way it had been worn smooth in certain places, the way the edges were shaped not by accident but by purpose, and the old man's gaze followed it, not with anger, not with fear, but with something else entirely, something that made the laughter around them fade just a little quicker than it had started, and from the edge of the group, Petty Officer Lucas Grant felt it settle in his chest, that same quiet signal that something was off, something important was being mishandled, though he could not yet explain why, only that the name, the face, the presence of the man standing there did not belong in the category everyone else had already decided for him. And as the wind shifted again, rattling a loose cable against the dock with a hollow metallic rhythm, the submarine remained still, but the moment around it was beginning to change. Lucas Grant did not move at first, but his attention locked onto the small piece of metal in the lieutenant's hand as if it had weight far beyond what it should, and something in the back of his mind began turning, slow at first, like an old mechanism coming back to life after years of sitting idle, because he had seen something like that before, not exactly the same, but close enough to stir recognition, and he shifted his stance, stepping slightly closer without drawing attention, his eyes narrowing as he tried to place it, while Mercer continued to hold the object up like proof of his own authority, turning it between his fingers with a casual disregard that felt increasingly out of place in the growing silence. "You are telling me this," Mercer said, his voice louder now, feeding off the last remnants of laughter around him, "this little piece of junk is your ticket onto a nuclear submarine," and a couple of sailors let out short, uncertain chuckles, but they did not carry as far this time, not like before, because something in the air had shifted, subtle but real, like the moment before a storm changes direction. And the old man's gaze never left the metal, not even when Mercer spoke, not even when the others reacted. It stayed fixed, steady, as if that object was the only thing in the world that mattered, and when he finally spoke again, it was softer than before, almost reflective. "It is not a ticket," he said, "it is a promise," and the words did not sound like an explanation, they sounded like a memory, and for just a fraction of a second, Mercer hesitated again, not because he believed him, But because the tone did not fit the situation, it did not match the script he had already decided this moment would follow, so he tightened his jaw and shook his head, dismissing it, pushing forward. "Well, whatever promise you think you have, it does not apply here," he said, lowering the metal slightly but not returning it, still holding control of the interaction. "This vessel operates under Navy command, not stories," and that was when Lucas felt it click, not fully, not clearly, but enough. A fragment of memory surfacing from a briefing room months ago, an instructor flipping through archived schematics, old footage of early submarine trials, talking about failures that never made it into official reports, about a near-catastrophic system fault during pressure testing, something about a manual override no one had accounted for, something about a man who had refused to leave the compartment until it was fixed, and Lucas took another step forward, his voice low, careful, directed more to Mercer than to anyone else. "Sir," he said, "maybe we should verify." But Mercer cut him off immediately, not even looking in his direction. "Stand down, petty officer," he said, the words automatic, sharp, leaving no room for discussion, because this was no longer just about the old man. It was about control, about maintaining the line he had drawn in front of everyone watching, and Lucas stopped, not because he agreed, but because he understood the chain of command, even when it felt like it was pointing the wrong way, and he glanced back at the old man, studying him more carefully now. The posture, the stillness, the way he stood without needing to prove anything, and that unease in his chest deepened, because men who were lost did not stand like that, men who were confused did not carry silence like that, and as the wind rolled in again, brushing across the deck and rattling the loose cable once more, Mercer finally let the metal piece drop back against the old man's chest, releasing it with a dismissive flick of his fingers. "This conversation is over," he said, stepping forward again, closing the space completely now. "You are going to step back, or you are going to be escorted off this dock," and the threat hung there, not loud, not dramatic, just firm, official, the kind that usually ended situations like this without question. But the old man did not move, and for the third time his eyes lifted to meet Mercer's, calm as ever, and somewhere behind them, deep within the silent mass of the submarine, something unspoken seemed to echo, as if the vessel itself recognized a moment that the people around it did not yet understand. The silence stretched just long enough to become noticeable, not empty, not comfortable, but dense, like the air before a system powers on, and Mercer felt it again, that same pressure he could not name, pressing against the edges of his certainty, but he pushed forward anyway, because hesitation in front of a crew was not something he could afford, not here, not now, so he shifted his stance and reached for his radio, fingers brushing the edge of it before stopping, not out of doubt, but calculation, because calling security would escalate things beyond a simple removal, and this still felt like something that should have been simple. "Sir, I am not going to repeat myself again," he said, his tone dropping into something colder, more official, the kind that usually ended conversations before they had a chance to continue. "Step away from the boarding access." But the old man did not respond immediately, and when he did, it was not to argue, not to explain, just a slight tilt of his head toward the submarine behind Mercer, as if acknowledging something that no one else could see, and then he spoke, quiet but unmistakable. "She was not supposed to survive that test," and the words did not belong to the moment, not to the dock, not to the present. They sounded like they had come from somewhere else entirely, somewhere deeper, older, and Mercer frowned, irritation flickering across his face. "What test?" he asked, not because he cared, but because the statement broke the rhythm of the confrontation in a way that demanded a response, and the old man's gaze shifted again, not to Mercer, but to a specific section of the hull, just aft of the forward hatch, his eyes tracing a line invisible to everyone else. "Pressure trial," he said, 300 feet equivalent, early cycle, before the reinforcement protocols were finalized, and this time, the words did not drift away, they landed, not loudly, but with precision, like coordinates dropped exactly where they needed to be, and Lucas felt it hit him fully. Now, the memory snapping into place with a clarity that sent a quiet jolt through his chest, because he had read about that, buried in a technical appendix most people skipped, a near failure during early testing of this exact class of submarine, a fault in a sealed compartment, something that should have caused a complete abort, but did not, because someone had stayed behind to manually stabilize the system, and the report had not named him, only referred to civilian engineering support, and Lucas took another step forward before he could stop himself, his voice lower now, almost cautious. "Sir, That incident was classified under early development records, he said, eyes fixed on the old man, trying to confirm what his mind was already beginning to accept, and Mercer turned sharply this time, annoyance cutting through whatever unease had been building. That is enough, he snapped, not looking at Lucas for long. Just enough to shut him down again, because the moment was slipping. And he could feel it, control shifting in ways he did not understand. We are not discussing old reports or whatever story he is trying to sell, and he stepped forward again, closer than before, closing the distance until there was no space left to interpret the situation as anything other than a direct order. You are done here, he said, each word deliberate. Step back now. And for the first time, the old man moved, not backward, not away, but just enough to reach up and adjust the small metal piece at his collar, his fingers brushing over it with familiarity, almost care, before letting it settle back into place. And when his hand dropped, he looked at Mercer again, steady as ever, and said, I did not stay because I was supposed to, and the dock seemed to hold its breath around them, every sound dulling just slightly, the hum of equipment fading into the background. I stayed because if I did not, he continued, she would have never come back up, and this time, no one laughed, no one moved, and even Mercer, standing firm in front of him, felt something shift that no order could immediately correct, because the submarine behind him, silent and immense, no longer felt like just a machine, it felt like proof. Lucas did not wait this time, the unease that had been building inside him now too strong to ignore, and while Mercer stood locked in place with the old man, holding on to authority like it was the only solid ground left, Lucas stepped back just enough to slip his hand to his pocket, pulling out his phone with a movement that looked casual to anyone not paying attention, but his fingers moved quickly across the screen, pulling up an internal directory he had memorized more out of habit than necessity, and he hesitated for only a fraction of a second before selecting a contact that sat far above his rank, far outside what protocol would normally allow. But this did not feel like a normal situation, not anymore, and as the line began to ring softly against the background hum of the dock, he turned slightly away, lowering his voice. This is Petty Officer Lucas Grant, he said when the call connected. His tone controlled but tight. I am at Pier 12, with the active vessel, and I believe there may be an identification issue involving a civilian. There was a pause on the other end, short but enough to signal attention shifting, and Lucas glanced back toward the confrontation, watching Mercer stand firm, watching the old man remain still, unyielding without effort. Name, the voice asked, direct, efficient, and Lucas swallowed once before answering. He has not presented credentials, sir, but he identified himself indirectly through reference to early pressure trials, and he hesitated, choosing his words carefully. He is carrying a metal tag that appears to be original issue, possibly from pre-commission testing. The silence on the line stretched longer this time, and when the voice returned, it was different, sharper. Describe it. Lucas shifted his gaze back to the object resting against the old man's chest, recalling every detail he had just seen. Small, irregular metal fragment, worn edges, no polish, looks like it was cut rather than manufactured cleanly, attached by cord, not regulation, and another pause followed, but this one carried weight, like something had just been confirmed without being said aloud. Stay where you are, the voice replied, quieter now, but far more serious. Do not escalate the situation, and do not remove that individual. The line ended without further explanation, and Lucas lowered the phone slowly, a subtle tension running through his shoulders as he slipped it back into his pocket, because whatever he had just triggered, it was no longer small, no longer contained, and back at the center of the dock, Mercer had taken one final step forward, his patience now fully spent, his voice cutting through the air with renewed authority. I am done asking, he said, you will step away from this vessel now. But the old man did not respond with words this time. Instead his gaze shifted past Mercer, not to the crew, not to the water, but toward the far end of the pier, where a distant vehicle had just come into view, its dark silhouette moving faster than anything else in the area, purposeful, direct, and though no one else had noticed it yet, there was something about the way the old man's expression changed, not in emotion, but in recognition, that made the moment feel like it had already begun to turn, and Mercer, unaware, still held his position, still believed he controlled the outcome. But the air around them had shifted again, deeper this time, heavier. As if something larger than the dock, larger than the submarine, was now moving toward them, and it was not coming quietly. The vehicle did not slow as it approached, its tires rolling over the concrete with a low, controlled hum that cut through the ambient noise of the dock, and one by one, Heads began to turn, conversations falling silent as the black government sedan came into full view, its presence unmistakable even without markings, the kind of vehicle that did not arrive without purpose, and Mercer noticed at last, his focus still locked on the old man in front of him, still holding the line he believed was his to enforce. "This is your final warning," he said, his voice firm, measured, but just beneath it there was a strain now, something that had not been there before, because even without looking, he could feel the shift around him. The subtle change in posture from the crew, the way attention had moved away from him toward something else, something approaching, and the old man did not respond, not with words, not with movement, only that same steady gaze, as if he had already seen this moment long before it arrived, and the sedan came to a precise stop at the edge of the PA, the engine cutting cleanly, the sound fading into a silence that felt deliberate, controlled. And for a brief second, nothing happened, no doors opening, no command shouted, just stillness, the kind that carried authority without needing to announce it, and then the rear door opened, smooth and unhurried, and a figure stepped out, uniform immaculate, posture straight, presence immediate, and even before his rank could be clearly seen, the reaction began, subtle at first, a chief petty officer straightening instinctively, a sailor adjusting his stance, conversations ending completely, because this was not someone who arrived unnoticed. This was someone who did not need to raise his voice to be heard, and Mercer turned then, finally breaking his focus from the old man, his eyes locking onto the approaching figure, and recognition hit him like a shift in gravity, Admiral Jonathan Reeves, and for a fraction of a second, Mercer's mind struggled to reconcile the situation, because admirals did not appear at docks like this without notice, without briefing, without reason, and yet here he was, walking forward with a pace that was neither rushed nor slow, but exact, each step measured, deliberate, and the closer he came, the more the space around him seemed to organize itself, crew members stepping aside without being told, creating a clear path that led directly toward the confrontation, and Mercer felt it then, the first real fracture in his certainty, because whatever this was, it had just moved beyond him, beyond his authority, beyond anything he had prepared for, and he straightened instinctively, his hand moving to his side, posture shifting into something more formal, more controlled, because that was what training demanded in the presence of command, but even as he did, his mind raced, trying to piece together how this moment had escalated so quickly, and behind him, the old man remained exactly where he had been, unchanged, as if none of this altered anything about his position, as if the arrival of an Admiral was not a disruption, but an expectation, and Admiral Reeves closed the final distance, his gaze moving past Mercer without pause, without acknowledgement, locking instead onto the man standing just beyond him, and for the first time since the confrontation began, the center of the moment shifted completely, not through words, not through orders, but through presence alone, and the dock, the submarine, the crew, all seemed to settle into a new alignment, one that Mercer was no longer controlling, one that he was now standing inside of, trying to understand, while the old man simply waited, as if the next part had always been inevitable. Admiral Reeves did not speak at first, and that silence carried more authority than any command could have, his presence alone shifting the weight of the moment as he stopped just a few feet from the old man, his gaze fixed, steady, as if confirming something that did not need to be said aloud, and behind him, the dock had gone completely still, every movement slowed, every sound softened, the low hum of machinery fading into the background as if even the vessel itself was waiting, and Mercer stood rigid to the side now, caught between protocol and uncertainty, his posture sharp but his confidence no longer anchored, because whatever this was, it was no longer his situation to control, and the Admiral's eyes moved briefly, not to Mercer's face, but to the small metal piece resting against the old man's collar, and in that single glance, something changed, subtle but unmistakable, a recognition that passed without words, and then, finally, Admiral Reeves stepped forward the last inch of distance, his boot stopping clean against the concrete, his posture aligning with precision, and without hesitation, without announcement, he raised his hand in a formal salute, held steady, deliberate, directed not at rank, not at uniform, but at the man standing quietly in front of him, and the effect was immediate, like a signal traveling through the entire dock, crew members straightening instinctively, conversations long gone now replaced by complete silence, because an admiral did not salute without reason, and certainly not to a man with no visible insignia, no credentials, no place on paper, and Mercer felt it hit him fully then, the realization crashing through every assumption he had made in the last 10 minutes, his mind racing to catch up to something that had already moved far beyond him, and the old man did not react right away. He did not return the salute immediately, he did not shift his posture or acknowledge the gesture with anything outward. He simply stood there, looking at the Admiral with that same calm, steady gaze, as if this moment was not surprising, not overwhelming, just another step in a path that had been set long ago. And after a brief second, he nodded, small, almost imperceptible, and lifted his hand in return, the motion slower, not because of hesitation, but because of age, because of time carried in every movement. And when the salute met, there was no sound, no command, just the quiet recognition of something that everyone else was only beginning to understand. And Admiral Reeves lowered his hand first, his expression composed, controlled, but there was something in his eyes now, something that carried weight beyond rank, beyond duty, something closer to respect, and he turned his head slightly then, just enough to acknowledge Mercer without fully facing him, his voice calm, measured, but leaving no room for interpretation. "Lieutenant," he said, "do you understand who you are speaking to?" And the question was not raised, not aggressive, it was precise, and Mercer opened his mouth to respond, but the words did not come immediately, because for the first time since this began, he did not have an answer, not one that fit, not one that held, and the Admiral did not wait long, his gaze returning to the old man as he continued. "This vessel," he said, his voice steady, carrying across the silent dock, "would not be here without him," and the word settled into the space like something permanent, something undeniable, and the submarine behind them, massive and silent, no longer felt like a machine at all, but like evidence, standing there in steel and shadow, of a story that had just stepped back into the present. And Mercer stood still, caught in the shift, the line he had drawn now completely erased, replaced by something far larger than he had ever anticipated, while the old man remained exactly where he had been from the beginning, unchanged, as if none of this altered who he was, only revealed it. Mercer felt every set of eyes on him now, not with amusement, not with casual interest, but with a quiet expectation that pressed heavier than any command he had ever received. And for the first time since he had stepped onto this dock as an officer, his footing felt uncertain. The clear lines of authority he had relied on now blurred by something far more complex than rank or regulation, and he straightened instinctively, his voice catching for only a fraction of a second before he forced it. "Steady, sir, I was enforcing access protocol," he said, directing the words toward Admiral Reeves, but even as he spoke, he knew they sounded smaller than they should have, narrower than the moment required. And the Admiral did not immediately respond, his gaze still resting on the old man, as if the explanation was not the point, as if the situation had already moved beyond justification. And when he finally spoke, it was not with anger, not with raised tone, but with a calm that carried far more weight. "Protocol exists to protect what matters," he said, "not to deny it." And the word settled into Mercer's chest with a quiet finality that left no room for argument, and the Admiral stepped slightly to the side then, shifting the space just enough to remove the invisible barrier that had been holding the moment in place, his hand moving in a small, deliberate gesture toward the gangway, not dramatic, not commanding, just clear, and every sailor on the dock understood it immediately. Because this was not permission, this was correction, and Mercer hesitated for a fraction of a second, his instincts pulling him in two directions at once, one toward the rules he had been trained to follow, the other toward the undeniable reality standing in front of him. And slowly, almost reluctantly, he stepped back, the movement small but significant, creating space where there had been resistance. And the old man did not rush forward, did not seize the moment. He simply stood there for a breath longer, as if acknowledging the shift not as a victory, but as a return to something that had always been his. And then he moved, one step at a time, toward the steel steps leading into the submarine, his boots making a soft, steady sound against the dock, and the crew parted without being told, instinctively clearing the path, not out of fear, but out of recognition. Because whatever they had thought before, whatever assumptions had filled the space when this began, they were gone now, replaced by a quiet understanding that they were witnessing something rare, something that did not happen often enough to be familiar. And as the old man reached the base of the gangway, he paused, just for a moment, his hand resting lightly on the railing, his eyes lifting to the hull once more, tracing the lines with the same quiet attention he had shown from the beginning. And Admiral Reeves watched him closely, his posture unchanged, but there was something in his expression now that had not been there before, something closer to memory than command. And behind them, Lucas stood still, his earlier unease now replaced by a sense of clarity, the pieces fully aligned, the story no longer fragmented. and Mercer remained where he had stepped back to, his mind replaying every word, every decision, the weight of it settling in slowly, not as humiliation, but as something harder to define. Something that would stay with him long after this moment passed, and as the old man began to ascend the steps, each movement steady despite the years behind it, the submarine seemed less like a destination and more like a place being returned to, something that had been waiting, silent and patient, for the one person who understood it in a way no manual ever could, and the dock remained completely still, no one speaking, no one moving, because some moments did not need narration. They simply needed to be witnessed, and this was one of them. The sound of his boots on the metal steps was soft, steady, almost lost against the quiet hum of the dock, but every person standing there felt each step as if it carried weight far beyond its sound, and when Ethan Ward reached the top of the gangway, he paused, not because he needed to, but because the moment asked for it, his hand resting briefly against the cool steel of the hatch as if greeting something familiar, something that had not changed even as everything else had, and the air around the submarine seemed to shift with him, subtle but undeniable, like a system recognizing a key it had been waiting for, and without a word, without a glance back, he stepped inside, disappearing into the interior of the vessel that had once depended on him in ways no one on that dock could fully understand. And for a few seconds after he vanished from sight, no one moved, no one spoke, the silence holding firm as if breaking it too soon would diminish what had just happened, and then, slowly, life returned, but not the same as before, not with the same casual rhythm. The crew moved differently now, more aware, more deliberate, as if something invisible had been placed into the space they occupied, something that demanded respect without asking for it, and Mercer remained where he stood, his eyes fixed on the empty gangway, replaying the moment again and again, the words, the look in the Admiral's eyes, the salute, and he let out a slow breath he had not realized he was holding, the tension leaving him not in relief, but in realization, because this had never been about a breach of protocol, it had been about understanding what protocol was meant to protect, and he turned slightly, his gaze finding Admiral Reeves, who had not moved far, still standing with that same composed presence, watching the hatch as if seeing beyond it, and Mercer spoke, quieter now, stripped of the certainty he had carried before. Sir, who is he? And the question hung there, simple, but carrying everything that had changed in the last few minutes, and the Admiral did not answer immediately, his eyes remaining on the submarine for a moment longer before shifting back to Mercer, and when he spoke, his voice was calm. But there was something deeper in it, something that came from memory rather than rank. He is the reason that boat made it past its first test, he said, and the reason every man who has ever stepped inside it came back out, and the word settled with a quiet finality that no one challenged, because they did not sound like praise. They sounded like truth, and Mercer nodded once, slowly, absorbing it, not as a lesson delivered, but as something earned through experience, something that would stay with him long after this dock cleared, and around them, the crew returned to their duties, but the atmosphere remained altered, quieter, more grounded, as if each person carried a piece of what they had just witnessed into the work ahead, and the submarine stood as it had before, silent, immense, but no longer just a machine in their eyes. It was a story, a legacy, something built not only with steel and design, but with decisions made in moments no one else had seen, and somewhere inside, Ethan Ward moved through the narrow passageways with the same steady pace, unseen but not forgotten, and the dock behind him slowly returned to motion, the day continuing as it always did, but not quite the same, not after a moment like that. Because some truths did not arrive with noise or recognition, they arrived quietly, revealed only to those who happened to be there when the past stepped forward just long enough to be seen, and then slipped back into silence, leaving behind something that could not be measured, only remembered, because respect was not something that could be demanded or enforced, it was something that revealed itself in moments like this, when everything else fell away and what remained was simply undeniable.